Hello and welcome to the Strength Syndicate Podcast, episode number 7, with myself, Shane Story, and my co-host, Lawrence King. How are you today, Lawrence?
I'm all right, lad. How are you? How's things?
Not too bad. How is training going for Series 7? Hitting
Um,
any spicy numbers?
Fairly mixed bag at the moment. Squatting on a power bar is actually pleasant. I don't seem to be getting the same bicep kind of issues I usually get. So far so good on that. Back to work, so I think that's kind of plus the research. So I think that's kind of making me um, a little bit unrecovered, a little bit tired, more tired than I thought I would. Um, Generally fairly okay. Like I'm plugging away. Like haven't hit any PBs yet, but I'm still only like 2 weeks into this block. What about you?
It's going okay. Hit a bench PB yesterday at a low body weight. It's actually this morning I was 89.8, and that's the first time I've been sub 90 since last August. So yeah, and the good thing is like strength hasn't dropped off at all. So with the reverse diet starting now, calories are only going to go up, and I presume kind of performance is only going to continue to improve. But I think I got away with it pretty lightly to like lose like 8 kilos and lose like no strength.
Yeah,
So yeah, pretty solid.
uh, yeah,
So today on the podcast, me and Lawrence are going to go over the importance of variation when you're training, specifically like related to like maybe the power lifts, and we are also going to go over the importance of doing your accessories and your assistant work, and how to essentially structure that within your training. Okay, so Lawrence, do you want to tell us a bit about what variations are to start us off with?
yes, I will. So I think it's kind of first important to kind of clarify what we mean by variation. So we're strictly going to be kind of talking about this in a powerlifting context. Um, I think for bodybuilding, variation is another rabbit hole. But just for the purposes of this podcast, we're just going to talk about variation. So when we talk about variation, we're talking mainly about a variation of our competition lifts. Our competition lifts are the squat, bench, and deadlift. So that is any variation of squat, bench, or deadlift. So just for example, your competition squat, a variation of that could be a pause squat, a tempo squat, a goblet squat, a front squat. And obviously, as the bars might change, these become less specific. So we'll come back to that concept of specificity later. But if you're looking to talk variations, you're generally manipulating one or more variable involved in the lift. That could be tempo. So you often hear of like a tempo squat, tempo bench. Some people I see on Instagram are starting to use tempo deadlifts, which is absolutely fucking brutal. I see Ryan McCann, actually, shout out to Ryan, good lad, doing tempo deadlifts for like a 3 second up and 3 second down or something fucking bananas like that. Then you could also manipulate bar positions. So we all hear about high bar, low bar, and the list is kind of endless. You could increase the range of motion, decrease the range of motion, and also you could add accommodating resistance. So lots to talk about there. Whereas if we move into accessories would be supplemental exercise, maybe used to address weaknesses or for the working towards the overall goal of benefiting your competition lifts. So your main lift could be a bench press, and your accessories for your bench press could be an incline dumbbell press. It could be a chest fly, and it could be a weighted dip. Generally, when you're kind of talking about variations, we're hoping to manipulate a training variable. Might prevent injury, might prevent staleness, but overall, the long-term goal moving towards the long-term goal of getting stronger. Does that kind of sound half on the ball there? Am I missing anything?
Yeah, no, it sounds like you're hitting the nail on the head. And the kind of good thing with variation is that there is so many of them that you can kind of pick and choose which ones to do over time, see which ones are going to benefit you the most. Because I suppose as one thing that Lawrence touched on there is like specificity is something that kind of gets a bit kind of overplayed in a sense within powerlifting, in a sense that like people will be like, if you want to get good at squatting, you have to squat more, and like that is true. However, if you're just going to do competition squat 3-4 times a week, like that's something that you may do for maybe one block or maybe two blocks, but it's not something that's going to get you stronger and stronger forever, nor is it something that's going to keep you quite interested in training. Anybody who has done like any like very hyper specific blocks, you will know that by the end of a block you fucking hate doing the lifts, and you're probably a bit banged up from repeating the same position over and over again. A lot of kind of niggles that people pick up from powerlifting training are like kind of overuse injuries. And then also we have to factor in just the relative load that you're lifting on every single lift. If you're doing your competition squat 2, 3, 4 times a week for months on end, your overall training intensity, your overall training load is getting very, very heavy on the same kind of tissues over a long, long time. Whereas if you implemented in some variations, some quite difficult variations, that are not only going to give you a bit of spice to your training, but also going to force you essentially to reduce the load. You could add a lot more time onto your training cycles, as well as just to your general enjoyment of training.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. But like I think you said something there, so there's kind of a twofold thing with variation where I don't know if anybody's ever ran like small of or fucking squat every day or anything like that. Your knees are turned to dust because you're overloading the same tissues all the time, even if your intensity undulates. But concurrently, it's just fucking miserable going in and squatting a comp squat 4 days a week. But furthermore to that, there is a thing called adaptive resistance, and essentially just over time your body adapts to the stimulus. It becomes less effective and your rate of gain will slow or stall. So then we're into the idea of variations, and I would probably maybe disagree with Shane a small bit in the sense that you probably could run an entire block of just squat, bench and deadlift quite effectively and make loads and loads of progress for probably I would say probably quite a long time, with minimal variations involved in that. Obviously your intensity would have to undulate and you might change frequency, but I think just in terms of exercise selection, basic comp squat, bench and deadlift will probably work for definitely novice lifters for quite a long time, as they build technical proficiency and get used to kind of what am I trying to say? Yeah, I suppose more technical. But then you've the timing of variations. I think, Shane, is something that's important for most people to consider if they are doing their own programming. Specificity coming to a competition is obviously going to be number one. So the proportion of the amount of comp specific lifts you'll be doing in terms of your weekly volume or the weekly amount of sets you do should probably increase. Whereas if you're quite far out from comp, if you're maybe like 16, 20 weeks, 36 weeks, whatever arbitrary amount of time you want to try it, the amount of variations you do, you could just entirely do variations pretty well. And the reason things or it's probably a good idea to get more specific as you come into comp, is that technical side of it, and the motor patterns and firing do change. That's something maybe Shane might want to talk about a little bit later, but really in essence, powerlifting, moving heavy weights, it's a skill, and it's something that just doesn't come out of the ashes one day after running a 16-week block of pause squats, and then you just decide you're going to test the strength on a 1RM comp squat. Probably just going to be disastrous. So that's why programs have that planned into it, that intensity planned into it. So Shane, if someone was listening to this, where's a starting point for variations? So let's go with let's just use a squat just for the crack. How could someone have a program with a little bit of specificity and implement some variation into a program? Where would they start?
I suppose I'll just touch back on something you said. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you in the sense that definitely novices don't really need like a lot of variation. Like as you mentioned, like technical proficiency and learning how to squat in the first place is going to be so key. Like learning to move that bar from A to B and not stopping at certain points or changing your bar position every time, maybe 2 or 3 times during the week or whatever, is going to be very important at the start. So I definitely agree there, and definitely in the early years, like if you can get away with just doing those movements like multiple times across the week, like why not? It just, I suppose, as you get years and years and years into training, sometimes the variations can help a bit. So in terms of like what we'd do to start off with the variations, like, I suppose one thing we have to think about is like, what are we going to be using this variation to address? So what is the reason that we're going to put a variation in? Is it maybe you struggle with kind of quad strength? Is it maybe you have a certain point in the lift that you seem to always kind of grind through? So if you have a sticking point, is there any kind of technical breakdown that's happening at any specific point during the lift? So that kind of gives us some basis to say, well, this variation might actually do you some benefit. And one thing to bear in mind is like the further you go away from what your competition style squat has got is, like the less carryover it's really gonna have. If you're doing like a front pause squat in heels when you usually squatting flats on low bar, it's gonna be a bit different. But it can have some benefits still, because you're still doing the moving pattern in a sense. You're working on your bracing, you're kind of keeping your chest up and pushing your knees out and all that. But still, you have to really kind of address what type of weakness potentially, or what kind of sticking point that you do have. And if you're unsure of what maybe a sticking point is, it's just the part of the lift where maybe you noticeably fail. So hopefully you're not failing too many squats and deadlifts. Probably most people have failed bench more than they care to admit, me included. But the point that where you fail the lift is probably your sticking point, but then again, you have to fail the lift somewhere. So if we look at your squat and your deadlift, then we can look at where in throughout the lift are you grinding the most. So say, for example, is it the top of the lockout on your conventional deadlift? On your squat, do you miss at the bottom? Most people miss at the bottom. Or are you really trying to grind that up towards the top? So those are going to give us some better ideas as to what to add in there. Or do you just lack with control on the lift in general? If you struggled very, very badly on the eccentrics, say for example, if you lack all control when you're trying to do a bench press, you probably need to sort that out, because as you get towards your kind of 90 to 100 plus %, if you're losing control on the bar on the way down, how difficult it's going to be to change the direction of that bar on the way up.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely agree with all of that. But there, I suppose there's two different ways a coach or somebody could go with that as well. I mean, it depends. Is the variation, from what you said there, I'd agree, but it just depends. Is the variation there to treat a technical issue, or is it there to treat a strength issue? It was something I was talking to one of the boys about there recently, is that to improve your squat, probably the best thing to do, most people would agree, is squat. However, if you've technical issues, like you said, there's a ton of issues there that someone could come across. Maybe their sticking point is coming out of the hole of the squat, or maybe it's at lockout, or maybe they're just not as controlled. Maybe their bar path is all over the place. Maybe they're like pushing their hips back too much. Maybe they're not hitting depth on squat. Maybe they're not like pausing their bench properly. Maybe they're not locking out their knees and their deadlift. These are all, I won't say simple fixes, but adding in a variation for those could maybe address some of those issues, as well as reduce the intensity or the load that is required to get a stimulus. I think that's a large reason for actually using variations. Like, I don't know, just think of like a tempo paused squat with a 4-second eccentric. There isn't a way in fuck are you using anything above like 60% for that comfortably. In the same way, like if you're using like a tempo close grip bench, you're using substantially less weight, while also getting some kind of a stimulus from that. So maybe you could also be nursing an injury, or you're using a variation on a day, saving some energy or trying to mitigate a bit of fatigue from an upcoming heavier session. So in my program at the moment, on a Tuesday I have a pause squat, and on a Thursday I have a comp squat. Most people probably running the abs system at the moment are probably doing the same, and largely most people could be using that pause squat for different reasons. I mean, if you pause squat, your position off the floor will have to be impeccable. Then you're pausing at the knee, so you have to be in a good position, otherwise you're making the lift infinitely harder for yourself. Then you're driving from that pause position, overcoming the inertia of the pause bar. So there might be a little bit of like an element of power development to that, because you're using a light load, and then you're standing up with it, and then you're doing that 8, I don't know, is it 4 sets of 8 or 3 sets of 8 or something fucking bonkers like that. But you're getting a stimulus from quite a low load, whereas then most people on the abs system at the moment are probably doing a quite heavy deadlift on a Thursday. And I mean, that's kind of around like that kind of system of like undulation of intensities throughout the week with a variation, and then a more comp specific one can be seen in shitloads of programs. Like if you look at the West Side system, with the conjugate system, that's done fairly quickly. They'll pair off like a heavy squat with a speed deadlift, as it's referred to. Essentially, this is just a very low RP single or double done for multiple sets. Similarly, they'll have a heavy bench day maybe on a Wednesday, and that'll be supplemented by on Saturday speed bench day. Again, people might think power training for powerlifting is arbitrary. Maybe it is, but again, the basis of it is just that it's a low RPE day supplemented with some accessories for hypertrophy. Like just really, really straightforward programming that I think most people, or I don't know, most people that would think like us, Shane at least, would agree with. So yeah, so we kind of just blurted it out there, but some basic steps, Shane, someone could use to implement some variation, so they know they should be squatting. But maybe let's say if your squat frequency is once a week, would it be fair to say maybe bumping that up to twice a week? And separating out some of their volume between the 2 squat sessions could potentially be a good idea.
Yeah, definitely. Well, if you're looking to improve the proficiency there, like not necessarily upping the dose, but just being able to perform on a separate day when you're a bit fresher will be allow you to perform with better quality. And then as well, you could potentially use one day, as you mentioned there, like undulate the loads. So one day you could be looking at using like 60%, then maybe another day you have more a heavy session. Because if you do the 2 and 1 and you're doing like one set, one or two sets or whatever, 80%, and then the next is 60, like obviously the performance at the 60% is going to be compromised. And if you're to do the reverse order as well, like you certainly would be using 80%. So they just be things to take into account. But like, I suppose, as we touched on already, if you can get away with kind of not using variations for a while and kind of keeping things around it kind of maybe 2 to 3 times per week squat frequency, then as maybe you notice, well, maybe I do have some technical deviations that I'd like to potentially address. Now, one thing to take into consideration is like technical deviations can be normal, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to look like a Chinese weightlifter when you do squat. Like, you know, you squat the way you squat, and you will always squat the way you squat, and you can't change your biomechanics. However, you can definitely maximize your mechanics essentially. You know, you can definitely, like, you know, if we look at, say, for example, something like knee cave happening on a squat, like we do see high level powerlifters squat with knee cave, okay, and like, you know, maybe who's to say that if their knees didn't cave that they would squat more. But like, you know, if we look at the kind of implications that the knee cave would have on the mechanics of kind of knee extension, we can say that, well, you're not necessarily going to be using your quads as efficiently as you possibly could, which is now you're maybe using more of your kind of erectors, maybe using more adductors to finish the lift. And most people are going to have stronger quads than they would have adductors. But yeah.
Yeah, the body moves in strange ways. And I just think it's like, I don't know, I suppose just on a side note, just having reductionist kind of views of how body should move and watching too much squat you probably about like if an elite squatter has a little bit of fucking knee valgus, i.e. their knee caving in, probably not the end of the fucking world. Like Usain Bolt, the fastest man to ever run, didn't come into or has scoliosis, am I right in saying?
I think one of his legs is slightly longer than the other. Aaron mentioned the scoliosis in the last podcast, but I hadn't heard that one, but I've definitely heard that one of his limbs is like slightly longer than the other. So yeah,
Just normality to sprinting technique, and like even if you look at like golfers, there's a golfer at the moment, Matthew Wolf. He was in contention there at the US Open. Really like strange looking swing, but just because his swing deviates from the normal accepted swing, that doesn't mean he can't get the job done in an efficient way. So it's the same goes for powerlifting. Julius Maddox, the goat of benches with like a grip that's terrifyingly close.
It's one of those things where it's like there is people on the kind of side, it's like technique doesn't matter, and then there's people who are like technique really matters. And then like I suppose anybody who's like trained people working in a gym, like I know from like coaching people myself, like if you see somebody deadlift for the first time and like, you know, when you see a deadlift that just doesn't look pretty, you're hardly gonna be like, well, that's probably just how they squat. Like so like, you know, you have to, like, if you think improvements can be made, like try to make them. And obviously we can't necessarily look at like the genetic elite and like, you know, the anomalies who
About to say we can't extrapolate what applies to the elite out to but I suppose what we're saying is just that you might have like minor variations. Your squat doesn't have to look like Dan Bell, or like you said, maximize what you have available to you.
Yeah. Otherwise we'd be just copying what Ronnie did.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So I think just a simple starting point for somebody looking to add some variations. Think of how far out from competition you are. If you're quite close to competition, like myself and Shane currently are, you're doing Series 7, aren't you?
Yeah.
So if you're quite close to competition like me and Shane are, we're 8 weeks out, maybe a good scalp of your training volume. So let's say if you're doing 20 sets of squats in a week, you might have, out of those 20 sets, you might have 10 of those being comp specific, maybe 50% of those are specific to your comp squat. And you might have 50% of those sets maybe being variations. Now, 20 sets of squats in a week is pretty high, but that's just a number. So look, just if you're somebody that's thinking of adding in some variation and you're maybe thinking of testing your 1RM soon, or you're coming up to a meet, think about what's important thing about it is how far away from the actual competition or the test date you are. So let's just say if you're doing 16 sets of squats a week, maybe out of that, you might have 50%, which may be comp specific coming into a peak. So you've more specificities, you're getting more training exposure to that competition lift. Then if you were a little bit further out, that could be as low as maybe 25%. So you might be doing maybe, I don't know, let's just say you're doing 16 sets still, and you're only doing 4 working sets a week of your comp, and you might have 75% of that of the distribution of your volume in more variations. And if you were to pick a day, let's say you're 4 days a week training, you might, if you're following maybe like squat, bench, deadlift, flow, or programming, you might have a day where you might do a pause squat, a tempo squat, have a competition squat, and then you might do a lighter, very light squat, then maybe supplementary to a deadlift or a bench day, which could be as simple as a goblet squat. I think generally for, oh Jesus, I might get thrown under the bus here, but generally for people that are not as strong, I think can get away with more frequency. And I just say that just because if you're somebody that's squatting 200 kilos versus somebody squatting 400 kilos, doing a pause squat at 75% for, let's say, like 4 fours on a Tuesday will have a much larger recovery demand than for somebody who might have a 160 kilo squat, squatting 120 kilos, say 75% for 4 sets 4. So you might get away, if you're a little bit on the less trained side, you might get away with a higher frequency. As you get more trained, I don't know, Shane, anecdotally, I've heard of like the likes Dan Bell or Eric Lillibridge, who might squat like heavy once a month. I think Dan Bell does 1 heavy squat every second week, and he'll deadlift heavy, and he'll deadlift and squat heavy on alternating weeks. And I've heard that kind of done before in the West Side system, say with equipped lifters, a lot of equipped lifters. Obviously there's a fairly different neural challenge there where you've an overload because of the equipment, but they would run a similar kind of pattern. So a lot of it just comes back to your training age and your training experience with variations. Would that be fair to say, Shane?
Yeah, no, 100%. Like what you touched on there with the kind of experience and like strength of the lifter. Like, yeah, if you have these kind of guys who are like squatting north of 300, you know, the sheer amount of energy it takes to like move that weight in general, and then have to think about, geez, doing that maybe like in and around that weight like 2 or 3 times per week is kind of unfathomable for a lot of people. Because I suppose, yeah, when you factor in like other things like there might be having to do across the program, like deadlifts, like, you know, even if you are somebody who's like 120 kilos, like you're squatting like almost 3 times your body weight, maybe three times across the week, whatever like that. Well, right now squatting 360 kilos across the week, but it is a lot of demand for your body to recover from.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a good segue so into accessories. So particularly if you are somebody that's at a pretty high strength level, and you're not, a lot of your training volume is kind of not a lot of your training volume, but maybe your training volume in your squat, bench, and deadlift variations is maybe reduced. From talking to, like, again, this is completely anecdotal, but just from talking to like a lot of the stronger guys, they tend to do, as they get stronger and they make big jumps in their lifts, the actual volume that they do for their squat, bench, and deadlift, either comp specific or variations wise, tends to be reduced because of the fatigue they get from doing any SBD work or bar work. So they end up doing quite a lot of accessories that take away from that kind of axial loading or spinal loading. Because I suppose the spine is only, regardless of how strong the muscles are around it, spine is the spine. So we kind of touched on it earlier, but your accessories kind of are supplemental to all the other work you're doing, your comp specific work, your variations, and your accessories might address, I hate using this fucking word, but maybe like muscular imbalances. But what I really mean is just if you've small fucking arms, you have small quads, and they tend to be limiting factors. Probably a good idea to add some meat onto the legs or onto the arms. Bunch of studies kind of, which we'll discuss, not crazy too in depth, but we'll just brush over them. Kind of showing single joint exercises longitudinally supplemented, multi-joint exercises longitudinally supplemented by single joint exercises. Probably a good idea. So Shane, you're a guy that has an interesting kind of way of, that I would use similarly, of using your accessories. Can you talk us through accessories, what you use, how you use them?
So I suppose the purpose of doing the accessory work is essentially to, as Lauren said, like add on a bit of meat. So after maybe your kind of initial years of lifting, a lot of the kind of strength gains you're going to get, like you probably have a lot of the neural adaptations that have occurred already. Like, if you're going to be training quite regularly as well, kind of lower loads, you're probably continuing to improve on them. Now, one thing that will kind of tap people out then is just their general size, really. So typically, like the more kind of muscle mass one potentially has, they have more potential to produce more force. And it's the more kind of like sarcomeres or muscle fibers that you have within, or the size of your muscle fibers, it will indicate the amount of force that like a muscle fiber can produce. So it's in our kind of best interest over time to, once we've kind of maxed out our strength capabilities with the body we have, try to essentially grow a bit more of the muscles that we want to enhance our force producing capabilities. Now, what maybe we could look at is, what are the kind of main areas outside of our powerlifts that, like, what are the muscles that are contributing essentially to our powerlifts that we can look at adding on a bit more assistance work. So say, for example, if we're looking at bench press, like, we could look at the triceps, because they are, I suppose, they are main elbow extensor that's going to be working during the bench press. So it's in our best interest to train it. So we could look at training it more specifically if we think that's going to have a bit of a carryover. So train it in a bit of shoulder flexion, the same way you would when you're actually lying on your back and you're going to have your shoulder flexed. So you can look at doing things like skull crushers, overhead tricep extensions, but also, like, one thing that Lawrence touched on is, like, we don't necessarily want to have any weak links, or we don't necessarily want to look like we just look like we have a powerlifting body or so. We kind of want to have
Sure.
kind of balance all over in essence. So, like, it would be a good idea to, if you are training triceps, like, don't have to just train them in shoulder flexion, train them in shoulder extension too. Again, when it comes down to lower body, if you're looking at hypertrophy in the muscles that are going to be contributing to your squat deadlift. Like obviously it's going to be very important to ensure that outside of maybe your low bar squat, if you don't necessarily get a huge amount of quad growth from them, or you don't feel like you get it, or you don't feel like they're quite taxed during the squat, like it could be a good idea for you to look at growing them, because over time it could be something that does limit you, like outside of the kind of neural specific adaptations you will be getting from squatting. Like muscle size can be a limiting factor, and we see it with people with the weight class restricted sport that powerlifting is. Like as weight classes scale, guys and girls tend to get bigger and a bit more muscular. What also scales? Totals. Now obviously we can look at somebody like Taylor Atwood, who is uh, stronger than most 105s in the US at the moment, judging by his total. But we can see the guys who are coming up to the top now, more muscular physiques than in the past. So I think that does count for some reason why you should maybe take your assistance work kind of seriously.
Yeah, no, you're hitting it, but it's not like it's no coincidence that an awful lot of the best raw powerlifters are horrendously jacked. Like they just look like slightly smaller bodybuilders. Like Jamal Brown or Yuri Belkin. Basically anybody under super heavyweight really is pretty lean for their weight class. Like they would definitely be like 12% body fat or potentially even less. And that's maximizing or minimizing the excess weight for obviously Wilks and Dots as well, because a lot of them are competing in pro meets. But it's also kind of getting rid of the idea that as a powerlifter you need to be fat to move weight. But I think for anybody new to powerlifting, or for anybody that is peripherally floating in and out, generally just picking a couple of accessories and spreading them out over the week is a good idea. And I think we have to look at kind of the motivations in adding accessories. Like you have the accessories you should do, and the accessories you will do. And there's a real distinction between those. Like, I mean, we probably all as powerlifters, we all probably need a stronger lower back. We probably need stronger hamstrings, probably a stronger core. But to tell the truth, I'm going to be hard fucking pressed to turn around the gym and be like, right, I have a half an hour left. Am I going to do some rows, some lat pull downs and some leg extensions, or am I going to do some pull-off press, some weighted planks and and some glute ham raises? I know exactly what I'm doing, but I know that with those 3 exercises, say maybe a leg press or a lat pull down, a barbell row and a leg extension, I know that I will stick to those and I will do those every Tuesday, and I will track and monitor the volume I do. I'll track and monitor the load, and obviously, like anything else, progressive overload still applies. You should still aim to get stronger in your accessories, and do that for weeks, months and months and months, and maybe change your accessories maybe every 2 blocks. I would say, Shane, I would be someone that would be kind of think that for hypertrophy, definitely, and for how long it actually takes for a muscle to get bigger. I think variation in your accessories is actually not something that needs to be changed every 2 months. I think you could kind of rinse and repeat your accessories for quite a long time without needing them to change, really. Would you agree or disagree? Or
Yeah, no, I'd agree 100%. I suppose with the powerlifts, or with the kind of powerlifting variations that you may do, like you're essentially looking to maybe use like a more single progression model with them over time. Like, you're really just looking to add load to that over time, and maybe stick to like the 5s or the 3s or whatever that you're doing. However, with the more kind of accessory work, like it is important to pick something that you will enjoy doing. It's something an area obviously that you need to improve also, but something that you can see yourself doing long term. Something that's even like something that we haven't talked about at all, but something that's going to be easy to do, maybe in the gym that you're even training in, on equipment that will be available, equipment that might be in every gym that you may go to as well. Like that, just these kind of things or other things you can think of. But with them, they have almost like an infinite kind of room for progression in a sense, depending on how you structure your progression framework. So, like with say for example, we look at rows or lat pull downs. Okay, with those we can essentially just pick a rep range that we want to work within, and say for example we say we're going to work within a 6 to 10 rep range or like a 10 to 15 rep range. Every week we're just essentially looking to add reps onto that up until the end of the rep range. Once you get to like the 15 at the end of the rep range, the next week you add weight, small increment, then start at the bottom again. Okay, and you can do that for months without needing to change actual exercise. And that even framework itself, that would be called double progression because you're changing two variables. But that essentially can be ran for so long because it has that RPE kind of system that we've already spoke about built into it. As you get up to the 15 or the end of the rep range, that is probably on your last few weeks of a training block when your RPE is probably at its highest for that movement. Then when you make the weight increment, if you take a weight that you did from 10 to 15, adding on 2.5 kilos is not going to be that much more difficult to do for 10 reps. So you're kind of starting at the bottom again, lower OPE, build it up over time, and you can do that forever. Like then if you're looking at even smaller exercises, so if we look at like if we're doing lat pull down or a row, we're still moving with pretty big like muscle groups, and we're doing like a multi joint lift. If we look at the more kind of smaller muscle groups, so say for example triceps could be something that's very frustrating. You try to jump from like a 15 kilo skull crusher to maybe your next weight increment is like 17 and a half. That 2.5 kilo could feel like a ton of bricks when you actually make that jump. So even that double progression framework might not be enough. So you might need to add in the triple progression, which is adding on a set as well. So essentially using those rep ranges again, maybe you have a set variation as well. So maybe you add 2 to 4 sets with 10 to 15 reps. Once you hit the top of your rep range, add on a set, start at the bottom of the barrel again, work your way up. Once you hit the top of both ranges, so 4 sets of 15, then you can look at adding on some weight and then start at the bottom again. So you can run these accessories for as long as you wish. Now, obviously, we can talk about the factor of, just general staleness. If you have been doing an accessory for 4 or 5 months, and you just like at some point as well, like your progression will just stop, even if you're using those kind of tricks. So one kind of rule that I'd usually use is like if something doesn't progress for three sessions in a row, just get it out of the program and just switch it to something that's similar enough, but it's going to give you another kind of area that you can look to progress in.
Yeah. I think as well, like one thing I would do with my accessories, I would do maybe more barbell, multi-joint accessories further out from comp. And then I would try, as I kind of get closer to comp, do more single joint exercises. So let's just say for the crack, my accessories on, I would only do, sorry, the other thing I would say, I would probably only do maybe 2 to 3 accessories max every day. Generally, I will do most accessories for 3 to 4 sets. If it's at the start of a block, I typically keep volume quite low because I generally try and reduce volume at the start of a block to try and mitigate any fatigue from the previous. So I'll drop my working sets on all my accessories down to 2 sets. And then I'll bring it back up then to reinstate the volume that I would have left off at on the previous block. So, but let's say if I was coming into comp and I was doing a pendlay row and a machine chest press and maybe a leg press, I will change that to maybe a lat pull down, or some kind of single arm row where I'm using a lot less load, and the exercise in of itself is, I would perceive it to be less fatiguing anyway. Then might change a chest press to a chest fly, again, reduce load, still getting a stimulus to the muscle I'm trying to train, but with less load. And then instead of maybe a leg press or a split squat or something, I might use a leg extension. And for me, I just find coming into comp, particularly using machines for accessories as opposed to free weights, fairly beneficial. I do notice a substantial difference in my recovery when I do that. Shane, that's something I saw on your Instagram. You did something similar the other day. You swapped to a machine instead of a barbell or something like that.
Yeah, generally when I get close to comp as well, I'll take out like something like barbell rows and just switch it in for some kind of chest supported row. Just
Yeah,
because, like, as you get close to comp, you want things to be as perfect as possible, and you want as little things to go wrong, like in any lifts. And like something like a barbell row, it's not necessarily a risky exercise, but for the amount of fatigue that you build up for an exercise that trains your back, all right, you could definitely pick better exercises, and it's a nice kind of ego booster when you're doing it. But if you move that over to something like a chest supported row, like, it's obviously going to give you way better stimulus in the muscle that you're actually trying to target, but it's also going to reduce a lot of fatigue and free that up for your actual deadlifts during the week, or your squats, which are the most important part of the program at that time. So I'd find the exact same. I'd switch over to a lot of machines. When I'm coming into a peak, I use a lot of things like cuffs as well. I've used those a lot over the last year, just to, I suppose, when you are squatting and when you're benching, and even when you're deadlifting to an extent, like, you're spending a lot of time with your wrist clenched as hard as possible. It's obviously, like, take into account with the low bar squat and then the bench as well, can put a lot of stress on the kind of elbow joint, lead up to the shoulder joint. And if we can minimize that by using kind of cuffs in some kind of areas, like, you can use those on like rear delt flies, for example, with a cable stack. You just attach the cuff to just below the elbow, and you're taking off a lot of kind of joint stress from the wrist and from the elbow as well, and you can just focus on essentially horizontally adducting the arms. So those are other things that you can look at. But yeah, machines coming into a peak, gonna be a lifesaver, really.
No, I definitely think so too. And like, I think using machines, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of not looked down upon in powerlifting almost, like, but it will definitely, if you have them available to you in your gym, or you even have a cable pulley system at home or something, I think their use can definitely aid towards the larger training goal. Is there anything else we need to cover?
I don't really think so. I think we've covered like what we wanted to cover with the variations with accessories, why you should do them, what type of ones you should maybe consider. So yeah, I suppose, like, we could sit here all day and kind of talk about like what accessories you should do, but like the easy way to look at it is like what muscle groups am I not training, and then what muscle groups are the ones that could benefit my lifting. If you're looking for a good kind of video on this, Rachel Kane put up a good IGTV. Rachel Kane Coaching on Instagram, but a good IGTV is the kind of the importance of doing kind of hypertrophy work for powerlifters. So, say for example, like some movements we just don't do in powerlifting. Like, we don't do much kind of knee flexion, full knee flexion. We do get our hamstring trained. Like, obviously, if we're doing deadlift, we're going to be training the hamstring in that kind of mid to length range at some stage. But we never really get the hamstring into its fully shortened position. So maybe adding in something like a hamstring curl could allow us to essentially grow our hamstrings as best we could, and kind of maybe increases the strength potential there. Things like just like shoulder shoulder abduction, so that'd be like lateral raises, that kind of stuff. But also horizontal adduction, uh, and some kind of shoulder extension, which would be essentially doing your lat pull downs, doing your rows, something to train your back. Because yeah, while we do train the back in some respect with the deadlift, a lot of the muscles there are just being really challenged isometrically, and we kind of know that isometric challenges aren't necessarily what is going to contribute to great muscle growth. Otherwise, you'd have lads doing well sits to grow their legs, and you just don't see that. So that is just they're just things to also consider in. So yeah.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Just train what's not getting trained from your main lifts. And that's pretty much it, lads.
Deadly, grand. So yeah, hopefully this podcast is useful. And yeah, if you liked it, you can definitely do all those things that people do when they listen to podcasts and they like them. So leave a review, follow the podcast, like it, share it on social media. Uh, you can message us on social media. I don't know, I've had a few people message me already, kind of saying that they like the podcast. Nobody said they have absolutely hated it so far, so we're doing an okay job on that front. So yeah, thank you for listening. If you want to find out more from us, you can follow Lawrence at
_ Lawrence King on Twitter and Instagram.
And myself is at story94. And that's pretty much it. So yeah, thank you for listening. Hope you have a great week, whatever you get up to, and we will talk to you in the next one.